behalf of the Raza Foundation and the India International Center, we welcome you this evening to the 62nd session of Art Matters. We have been here for more than 6 years now, and we'll give you some relief in the next 2 months when we will not be there. We could also do other things than Art Matters. Today we have a young scholar from Delhi who lives in Kuwait, for reasons best known to her. But Dr. Roma Madan SONI is an assistant professor of art and design at Box Hill College, Kuwait. Why should Kuwait have a name like Box Hill College? But anyway. She had done her thesis, doctorate thesis, Reveal to Reveal AMRITHA SHERGI'L'S. So she is quite an expert on AMRITHA SHERGI'L'S, and she has spent 18 years as an educator in the Middle East and has received various recognitions, including some awards. The UN Habitat facilitated her for her presentation titled Art for the Community and Landmarks on World Habitat Day. She received a commemoration from the Kuwait Ministry of Private Education and a certificate of appreciation by Sheikh Sabah Jaber Al Sabah, Kuwait Beautiful and Green Khalifa School. So there you are, and the rules of the game as usual are you can speak up to 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for some comments and question answers. There you are.
Thank you.
Go there. You go there.
Good evening, everyone. At the onset, I would like to thank Ashok Vajpayeeji, the Raza Foundation, Vivan Sundaramji, to have me here at the IIC amongst all of you this evening. And it is totally my honor, my pleasure and my privilege to share my research, AMRITHA SHERGI'L'S, 2 girls, with all of you at this time. I hope you enjoy the presentation. So, I do examine artist and writer AMRITHA SHERGI'L'S portrait, 2 girls. AMRITHA lived between 1913 and 1941. She was born of a Hungarian mother and an Indian father, and she studied at École des Arts in Paris. Her work, both her paintings and her writings, ensued at the crossover setting, colonial imperialist Swaraj demanding India, World War I, World War II, patriarchy, and her feminist self. I investigate her endeavors, her triumphs, her accomplishments through her art and her very existence as a subject of colonization, of patriarchy, of the world wars, and that enabled her to challenge dislocation, desires, the cultural diaspora, and of being an insider-outsider in a world of inconsistencies and ambiguities. In the decades since her death in December 1941, AMRITHA's work and image have grown more universal. A quick search online and you can find her likeness on mugs, t-shirts, earrings, water bottles, and more. In contrast, my presentation is going to provide you with an opportunity to see another dimension of the unfathomable, world-renowned artist AMRITHA SHERGI'L'S, a more complex, layered view of her political and feminist identity. as in her painting, Two Girls. Before Amrita becomes a modernist, pop culture, image fart, and an icon of modernity for the woman of India, she was a complex artist who fought against male artists that came in her way of creating true art, through family issues, her mother's eccentricities, her father's national patriotism, which led to the family's financial dilemmas because the British government had taken away all their wealth, and the political turmoil in the country, and a difficult marriage with husband Victor. So I'm really excited at the possibility of people understanding how complex Amrita Shergill was, socially, politically, culturally, historically at her time. Most of the ways young people understand her today based on conversations that she wouldn't even have had in her lifetime. It's also very interesting how a historical character transcends her historic moment and becomes an alive, iconic figure for us. As a daughter of an Indian father and a German-Hungarian immigrant, Shergill challenged conceptions of her biracial and Indian identity and celebrated her indigenous roots as a radical act. Her nephew and renowned artist, Vivan Sundaramji, pulls in the viewer to see her black and white photographs. He adds an extra level of sensory immersion and light in the space. These photographs were taken by her father, Umrao Singh Shergill. So Vivan Sundaramji pops up the word with vivid details. And throughout the space, he works with pieces of Amrita's identity, giving them shape. Her fascination with the traditional sari began very early and became part of her persona as she walked through the streets of France and traveled between Hungary and Europe and India. And her friend Denise Furter described her as follows: "The Sultana Shehzade speaks French like a Parisian, but the soft blue sari draped around her heightens her amber and ochre complexion, evocative not of the banks of the Seine, but of the strange distant shores of the Ganga." Amrita makes it very clear that she would wear only saris and traditional clothes in India. She wouldn't wear European clothes because only Europeans wore them in India. And she clearly makes her position, clarifies her position as an Indian native, subjugated by colonization, pursuing egalitarianism, seeking to regain her space. Studies of temple ruins, of architecture, of landscapes, sketches of people as hierarchicized and primitive, all contributed towards the construction of the travel postcards and travel posters that were taken by Thomas Cook to Britain to be for India to be exhibited as a primitive, untouched land. Amrita shows concern towards this and basically says that it's not only the European artists, Renaissance artists, who do this, but it's the Indian Bombay and Bengal fine art school artists that create these paintings. And they're not even true representations of India, and not works of art. Sonal Kuller, art historian Sonal Kuller, shows us how she paints brahmacharis in the center to break the cliche and hierarchy and primitivism in British photographer Martin Hurleyman's photograph, Brahmacharis. For more information on the travel posters and postcards, we could look at Saloni Mathur's thesis. She was convinced that if the family had not moved to Europe, she wouldn't have realized how the frescoes from Ajanta, or the sculptures from Music Imit, or the paintings of Mattancherry Palace were worth more than the whole Renaissance. And she wanted to come back to India to appreciate their worth. Her observation of content, color, form of art in India and Europe helped her build a critical understanding of the Indian aesthetic emotion, or the Raza, to be included in her work. There are ways in which she was referred to as fragmented and unstable. There's all this language around disability that really needs to change. Her relationship with her body was very candid and direct. And there's a lot of language in the critics' writing which find really fascinating. For example, comparing two Amrithas with two Fridas as brash and opinionated. On one hand, desperate, melancholic, with traumatized body and self on the other. The critics describe their erotic, tortured lives with their vivid allegiances towards their home countries. And as we see, Amrita paints two girls as her autobiographical self-portrait, which Vivan Sundaram describes as a curious, amusing conception of form. It was painted soon after her move from India to Europe, after her marriage with cousin Rita. 1/3 of Amrita's oeuvre of paintings is autobiographical, especially Two Girls, which illustrates, I analyze her relationship with her historical past, her recent past, her present, and her future. In 1939, Amrita paints Two Girls. She plasticizes her autobiographical form to deliver multiple understandings. In her work, she paints both forms, almost completely naked, disparate from her self-portraits in the past, in India or in the West, say self-portrait 9 that we can see here. In Two Girls, huge areas of the canvas are unfinished, rendering it ageless and spaceless. Amrita deconstructs the space, opens up the forms, modeling them with neutral colors, in contrast with the bright colors she used in the past, as in self-portrait 5 here. The female figures seem architectonic and frozen in their poses, much like Cezanne's large bathers. Like Cezanne, taking classical forms from the past, she provides them with sculptural solidity, making them subservient to the content, building the stage for abstraction to come in the 20th century. The body, based on optical experience, was the primary vehicle for Amrita to convey her feelings and emotions. But this painting is active in a formal sense, rather than a representation of the natural like the 19th century painters did, or the Bombay and Bengal school fine artists did. The gaze of the forms is unpredictable. It's in flux. The faces and figures are barely sketched, just begun, reaching back to the grand traditions, as if they were made of plaster, flat and unfinished, malformed, elongated, with multiple sides of the body visible, very similar to the 2700 BCE bronze statue of the dancing girl, or even the 7200 BCE Ain Ghazal statue from Aman, one of the oldest sculptures that can be seen today. In contrast to the male artist, subject as object, Amrita paints and celebrates the othered. Amrita was unapologetically political, and through her writing and her painting, she constantly critiqued both the Western and Indian male artists that came in her way of creating true art. She made life-size paintings of the everyday woman in the midst of her routine problems, subjugated both by colonization and patriarchy at that time. As we can see in her painting of the sweeper woman, Woman on Terrace. She openly spoke her mind and stood up for the other and the oppressed, and against prejudice and bias. She's explained how good art does not look at the external characteristics of the subject of the work, but it looks at the bitterness of performance, of the energy, the strength, the aesthetic emotion, and the fundamentals of form. She described the work done by the Bombay and Bengal school fine artists and the European Renaissance painting as form being photographically imitated in an incorrect sense of external attractiveness, as can be seen in Raja Ravi Verma's painting Fresh from Bath, Bombay school artist S.D. Chakur's painting Oleti, or Bengal school artist Hemendra Majumdar's painting Beda, and Western artist Ong Roy's painting La Sauce. In 1939, Amrita replaced the male artist's nude subject as object with her self-portrait Two Girls. Unlike her paintings from her recent past in India, like the village scene, or in her past in Europe, Young Girls, the forms, the subjects in this painting are not in communication with each other. They don't even look at each other, but their juxtaposition holds great significance in their relationship and that with the viewers. In Two Girls, both subjects stare out of the canvas with a gaze of concern on their faces as Amrita addresses the problematic of the gaze, providing a much larger picture of trepidation to her viewers. Unlike her self-portraits from the past, say Torso, Amrita masquerades the masculine and the feminine. She shows a binary distinction in painting. Many of Amrita's paintings, including her self-portrait Two Girls, have been left out as whitewashed versions of her life. I will explain through her work her support for the othered and how she stands up against prejudice. There are pieces of her identity I will discuss that she wasn't very public about, say her exploration of gender norms. Many critics said that she learned form from Gauguin. Learning form from Gauguin, which originated from her own original culture, she analyzes the art of Ajanta, Ellora, the Rajput and Mughal paintings, and Madanchari Palace. In her self-portrait, her glance is for the othered. She combines abstraction, symbolism, plasticity to enkindle the rasas in her work. Amrita's self-portrait, unlike Gauguin's, is neither set in the midst of fertile nature, nor does it visibly display any erogenous attraction to her body form. She doesn't hold any or cradle any lush fruits in her arms, nor is she being offered any refreshing flowers, as can be seen in Gauguin's Two Tahitian Women on the left. Gauguin's objectifying strokes on the woman on the left and the masculine gaze of the form on the right cannot be seen in Amrita's portrait, but she is influenced by Gauguin's style and theme, and she juxtaposes a light and a dark form, and both naked. But to subvert the trope of Gauguin, she uses native, indigenous primitivism to show subjugated nativity wrapped in khadi, is opposed to Gauguin's fixed contained representation of his fleshy peach nudes, iconic of availability. Simultaneously, her own form on the right is inspired by Van Gogh's humanism, as in The Man is at Sea, painted by him in 1889, and her own painting, Mother and Son, as we can see on the right, painted half a century later. Amritha's critical association to the radical paradigm of identity of the subjugated can be seen in her work Resting Mother and The Beggars, a stimulus from Van Gogh's Wheatfield and Crows. As Amritha says that she loves Van Gogh and she can see the character reveals itself in one's work, and especially Van Gogh's. After returning to India, she declares her liberation from Gauguin and continues with her appreciative comments for Van Gogh. She finds strong connections between her methodological approaches of active painting and reflective writing as Van Gogh's. And she talks about Martin Heidegger's appreciation of Van Gogh's true art, creation of true art, in his essay, The Origin of the Work of Art. Amritha presents herself as naked versus a model as nude. Like Frida Kahlo's Two Nudes in the Forest on the right, which were painted in 1939, Amritha paints two girls in 1939. In painting herself as naked, yet self-acclaimed and self-desiring and not objectified, Amritha addresses the question of the female nude in art. Distinguishing between nakedness and nudity, Berger expounds, to be naked is to be oneself. To be nude is to be naked but not be recognized for oneself. A naked body has to be seen as an object in order to become a nude. And this was possible through the medium of art. Unlike nakedness, a nude is an art form which objectifies and others the woman. Art historian Geeta Kapoor compares Frida Kahlo with Amritha and explains how these women artists painted themselves naked, they never painted their subjects naked. Amritha embodies the performative role of the nude in her portrait, masquerading between female sexuality and her imaginings as an artist in context with the female body in the early part of the 20th century. Amritha addresses the problematic of Orientalist painter Henri's reclining nude, Grand Odalisque, painted in 1814. Bestowing the cliched theme of the reclining nude painted by the great masters with an evocative form of a woman resting on a charpoy, as we can see on the left. And she renders her a vulnerable object, yet a self-desiring subject of the gaze, as she declares it's a sensual picture, but not sensual in the effort, rather repulsive manner of our Bombay fine art educators. Abstracting her form, the form of her subject, she uses the semiotics of color symbolism to denote meaning and to create storytelling patterns for the 20th century. In paintings like Siesta, as Geeti Sen describes, her subject is simultaneously veiled, passive yet sexually charged. So her subject becomes both an object for scrutiny, at the same time a woman who's expressing ardent desire. Such a body defies any mythic association and reveals to confirm the reality of the socio-political situation, the time. Amritha paints herself as black and white. She had never positioned a contrasting light figure with a dark figure in any of her self-portraits in the past, as we can see in this slide. In Two Girls, the lighter figure is upright and bare, and the darker figure is seated and partially veiled. In this painting, she has split her own identity, Eastern and Western, masculine and feminine, to portray the complexities in the relationships, as the French masters did in their Orientalist paintings, to portray race, gender, and sexuality, but in an incongruous manner, as we can see in Jerome's Moorish bath. As Sundaram considered, in a personal discussion, the forms appear to be angular with large hands and feet and strong planarity. And I add, Amrita's left form shows active masculinity and her right form shows primitive, passive primitivism. Amrita's dual forms derived from her Western and Eastern lineage concurrently demonstrate the dualism and commonalities of her own bicultural, dual racial and gendered identities. She borrows from her historical past. The left form in Two Girls symbolizes the unflinching, poised and self-desiring image of the bronze statue of the dancing girl from India's ancient past. She indicates the extensive, self-assured attitude of the glorious era when nakedness in women was depicted in a splendid way, amalgamated with indisputable sensuality without reducing the woman to an object. Amrita embodies the charismatic figurine from the Indus Valley civilization of Mohenjo-daro, close to Lahore, where she grew up as a young girl. On her visit to ancient Harappa, Amrita had written, "It was very interesting, and there were two statues about 5,000 years old that were superb, in addition to a lot of fine seals, jewelry, and pottery." In deriving her form from the sculpture, she demonstrates paradoxical standpoints and dualistic standards regarding gendered construction, which had evolved in India with the passage of time between the binary forms. She marks between the stance of the woman from India's ancient past and the present-day post-colonial India. In semblance with the bronze figurine, she constructs the left form, signifying a naked, slender woman, lean, elongated arms and legs, with minimal flesh on the body, different from other sculptures of the same period found in the vicinity. It is dissimilar from Amrita's previous representations of herself, like the self-portrait of as a Tahitian, where her breasts are in full form. In the painting, as well as in the statue, there's insignificant anatomy in the joints, a lot like much later Indian sculpture. The seated, uncovered limb passive form on the right is iconic of the woman's present condition at that time. She embodies the isolated widow, the child bride, the young girl who's either a wife or a daughter-in-law at home or a mother-wife. It signifies the patriarchally subjugated setting of the time. In stretching her covering, her inadequate wrap shows the ambiguity of the time. Her gaze describes disquiet and moves out of the canvas towards the colonized setting. Two Girls show how women lose their true powers, but a myth about the strength and the power of the woman is constructed. They depict the capitalist manifesto of the then present. The white backdrop behind the form on the left denotes white capitalism of the time, and behind the form on the right, or enwrapping the form on the right, Khadi shows patriarchal framework in control. Partha Chatterjee explained how the West used capitalist ideologies and the East employed the patriarchal framework to control the woman. The maternal right form symbolizes glorified motherhood, where the woman needed to be sexually accessible to sustain the lineage, whereas the minimal maternal traits of the form of the left, on the right, shows loss of reproductive rights and the powerlessness because of the capitalist ideologies used by the West. Accordingly, AMRITHA shows that color dichotomy suggests that lightness is good and color and blackness is bad, which has kept the women of color suppressed and in the background. As Chandra Talpade Mohanty suggests, the feminist movement has historically been lacking the voices of women of color. Prostitution, capital turned glamorous. As Balzac addressed his heroine, "You are, in the files of police, a number apart from all social beings." Since the classification prostitute was a necessity, it would have sexual, social, and modern representations tightly knitted together and disseminated as singular by the bourgeois society. The prostitution was the main representative of modernity in the 1860s. It signified a threat to modernity, and it spelled out shocking details about capital turning glamorous when represented in this form, with sexuality yielding to the social in a wrong way. So Amrita's primitive model here drapes the indigenous khadi, freeing the subject from the colonizer's gaze, as well as becoming a Parisian prostitute at the time. Amrita includes tangible components such as fabric in her work to reveal the power of the local setting, as we can see in two women painted in 1935. The unembellished white stretched sheets, which contain the models on the canvas in Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon on the right, depict the white sheets that have been draped on French prostitutes to represent Oriental models of the time. In her tailored piece of work, in the form on the left, Amrita's form on the left defies the master by throwing away the white shroud and retaining within herself the right to reveal or conceal herself. Amrita derives from the present. The woman of India, in a political context, turned into the emblem of India in Abhindranath's painting Bharat Mata and Bankim Chandra's song Vande Mataram, embodying both the indigenous Hindu nationalist culture in brilliant vermilion, the political image that could be fetishized to unify the subjects of the nation, and Bharat Mata was idolized to be eradicated. In contrast, Amrita paints Mother India in earthen reds as mouldering vermilion, the symbol of a troubled motherhood in India, and described her great soulful eyes in a melancholy face. Amrita's non-mythical Mother India portrayed the true ambiguities of the woman as an agonized mother-wife dealing with the problematic of the time. Excluded women, whitewashed widows, personal tragedy but public loss. Two girls symbolize manifold significances. Amrita's ailing, inert right form and two women in white, unveiled, reveal the physical, material, and psychological loss of both the women and the nation as the Hindu sati and the Hindu widow, especially in the East. In the stronghold of the patriarchal framework, as Tanika Sarkar explains, the excluded widows were always the worst victims of gender discrimination. Similarly, in male artist Goya's singing and dancing, canterbury drawing from the Witches and Old Women album, the old woman opens her mouth and is unable to sing. She tries to hold the guitar and is unable to play, and she's hovering in mid-air. Beneath her sits another old woman, pinching her nose and looking up her companion's skirt, with a bowl and spoon beside her, symbolizing a witch. Goya excluded the broomstick and the cat of the old white-haired old aged crone flying on a broomstick, but used all cliched aspects of old women as bad and unable women, symbolizing a witch. And he combined it with Moratine's comedy, where Moratine showed humor from evil, old women, evil and devil worshipping and performing sorcery at night. Therefore, they showed old women as bad women, and thus creating a fixed stereotype for good women. In contrast, Amrita's portrayal and feelings for the othered can be seen in her Two Women in White and her professional model, who is a model no more, and she makes a portrayal of an isolated, excluded women and whitewashed widows in her first essay in art, as they described it, portraying a picture of a model no more, now discarded, poor. Each line and a loose fold of skin on the model's face narrated a story of a woman who once must have been beautiful. Inexpressive eyes and active textures. She paints the body not merely as a form. The professional model and the Two Women in White were Amrita's sardonic response to the patriarchs and the male artists' discarded, aging women entrenched in post-colonial India and the West. She predicts the future. She validates vermilion, feminine fulfillment, the child wife, the child bride that she paints. In painting child wife or child bride, Amrita elucidates how the everyday life of the commonplace girl woman in nationalist India oscillated between being the stifled daughter at home to the daughter-in-law who embodied the characteristics of a mother-wife. It's an iconic portrayal of the manipulation of the girl child towards the construction of nationalism. Amrita had described her work as the forlorn child bride is a marvelous evocative piece where she details her little finely curved and rose-hued lips like drooping rosebuds. Here Amrita refers to the fragile life of the child bride, wife at that time in the East, in semblance with the drooping rosebuds of the Western Vanitas painting that portrayed and symbolized still life, as it reminded viewers of the instability of life, of the terseness of existence, and of human death. Still life painting in Protestant Netherlands had separated from the church, and there was no religious meaning attached to it. Every flower that was taken by the Dutch East India Company from Southeast Asia to Netherlands had symbolic meaning attached to it. So Amrita is actually talking about the drooping rosebuds like lips of the child bride, which by George Hufnageli, the engraver, as shown in his engraving, if you look at the engraving in the center, is a drooping is a rosebud, but the petals are drooping, symbolic of the child bride. The stem of the rose has been looped in by a snail fantastically stretching out of its shell and symbolizes the patriarch who chains the little bride in matrimony. Beneath is stretched a white radish with its shadow, and on the white radish is stretched a caterpillar waiting for exploit of the child's wife's resources, and he symbolizes the colonist. On both sides of the engraving are nailed the columbine and the daffodils as a community which are unable to do a thing with the patriarch and the colonist. So both the rosebud, George Hefnegly's engraving, and Amritha's child bride symbolize the paradox of a fantastical future as a child, which has been marred by the patriarch's marriage as a young wife of the child bride. Amritha employed passionate vermilions to symbolize menstrual blood, the color of the bride, the blood of vehemence, when a daughter is born, to intensify the performance of form and color, to render mood and power to the woman in the painting, to portray the iconic influence of vermilion in matrimony and motherhood in their lives, as we can see in her paintings. Yeah. To conclude, I'd like to say that in the presentation I have shown that narrative, analysis, and philosophy are encrusted in Amritha's biographies. I reveal the unidirectional and yet effective processes that disregard the artist's creative socio-political production as her personal documentation. Amritha uses her body as a space gap between her Eastern and Western identity and identity of her native peers, while seeking her own self as a woman, a feminist, and an artist. I recommend the celebration of strengths of women artists like Amritha in empathizing and embodying the suffering of the othered. I endorse the commemoration and recognition of artists like Amritha who creatively immortalize resistance against subjugation and control, explicitly spell out variances between active and passive, colonized and colonizer, woman and man, and other gender dichotomy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this placing a single painting in a varying, remarkably varying context. So if there are any questions and comments, the mic will reach you. Raise your hand. Let the first hand be raised. Yes. Keep the mic close to your...
Hello, yeah, can you hear me? This was really profound. This was an amazing presentation. I've been, so one of my friends had introduced me to, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
So I was introduced to Gill's first painting, The Three Women. And I barely knew anything about her, but this definitely gives me an incentive to read way more into it. So, as you started by telling us that if you Google it, you know, the millennial point of view of looking at an artist like Gill would be in various ways. So, would you suggest what could be a good starting point for me to gain more knowledge about her or have a better understanding in ways that you just explained?
Okay, I'll keep it very short and simple. The best way to learn about her, the way I did, is read artist Vivan Sundaram's book, the collection of her letters and her paintings. Right. Both together, combined together, because like I said, she was a very active painter. She died really young, but she's, you know, created a whole mass of paintings and very reflective writing with her that goes with it. And let's see if Vivan would like to add to that. And there's a lot of work in her. Of course, visit the museum, actually go and see her work. And there's other work on her, like I was showing imagery. Also, you know, all of it has been put together by Vivan Sundaramji. So, would you like to add to that?
Yes. Oh, where is the second hand?
Who's next to them?
These two girls represent her sex orientation of lesbian, and that's why she could not survive her family life.
No, not really. She was married.
No, but that was not successful.
No, she died soon after marriage. That's not why she passed away. How would you say it's not successful? Oh, because of her relationship? No, that wasn't the point. She was really in love with her husband before marriage, and then after marriage too, she was with him. She passed away in her own home, her husband's home. So she was bisexual to some extent, but that was fine. That was nothing to do with her. There was nothing wrong with her relationship with her husband. Is there something that you...
I suppose your presentation has been so overwhelming that people are still trying. Oh no, no.
Thank you so much.
She is not so overwhelmed.
I'd say I was sufficiently overwhelmed. I'd like to ask you, what would you say was her most iconic work of art?
I guess this one, and that's why I've worked on this one. And this is just,
Other than this?
I did work on the self-portrait of the Haitian. And this is, this just is part of my research, a very small part. I have 3 extensive chapters written on this portrait itself. I'd like to share more later.
Well, if there are no questions, thank you very much. As I told you in the beginning, the Raza Foundation will be taking leave from you for 2 months, and then we resume. We have a running series called Gandhi Matters to coincide with 150 years of Mahatma Gandhi. And in that we'll have 2 very unusual presentations. One will be Ghulam Sheikh, Riaz Komu and Atul Dodia, who have both adopted images of Gandhi, to talk about their art and Gandhi. And we'll have a presentation by Kalapini Komkali. Kumar Gandhar created a new rag called Gandhi Malhar. So she'll sing that and also explain what kind of an impact Gandhiji had on classical music, if at all. So these are the 2 which we have scheduled. Then we conclude in October with a kind of a 3 or 4 presentations, Gandhi and Mandela, Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Gandhi and Dalai Lama, which will be perhaps sometime in October. As for the art matters, we'll resume in July, and since we have not yet been able to rope somebody in, we cannot announce the theme or the speaker. Thank you very much. Continue to come, take leave for 2 months, but resume with vigorous energy after that, at least in attending our events. Thank you.
Can we get a copy of this? The presentation? Yeah, sure.